So how do we get our art from this to this? The answer is by using grids. I've used grids in my drawings for most of my time as an artist, and I think they're incredibly useful at getting everything as accurately placed as possible, but I get a lot of questions asking how I use them. So today I'm going to show you my process from start to finish and explain how grids help me get my work as close to the photo as possible. The first thing I do is get my reference image and crop it how I want. I then add a grid PNG I save from Google and I edit it to fit the image, making sure it fits with the size I want the drawing to be. Next I draw the grid on the paper. I use a mechanical pencil to do this and I draw it as lightly as I can. We want as little of the grid showing as possible by the time the drawing is finished, so try not to dig too deep with the pencil. I tend to be a bit obsessive when drawing grids. I draw the outer rectangle, then measure it to the edge of the page to make sure it's centered nicely. Then I make any adjustments needed before doing the rest of the lines. Once we have the grid, we can start the outline. A good outline is incredibly important. If you're having trouble getting an accurate outline, you could try adding more grid squares. The easiest way to do this is to halve your square size and double the amount of squares, then you get twice as many squares without having to change the size of the drawing. I think having more squares can make it easier because you have more reference points, but then more squares can also get a little complicated because it's easy to lose your place and it's sometimes tough to remember what square you're supposed to be working on. Other than that, it's really just about copying what you see on the reference. How much of an outline you draw is up to you. Some people like to leave it quite basic and some people prefer to make it more detailed and in-depth. I like to have mine relatively detailed. I like to map out as much of the shading areas as I can so I can keep track of it all later. Once the outline's done, I erase the grid so that it doesn't show up underneath the finished drawing. It doesn't happen as much on darker tones, but it can happen quite frequently on lighter tones and is always annoying. I try to erase the grid to the point where it's either completely gone or it's faint enough to not be a problem while still leaving me enough of a grid to use later on. And here we have the outline and the faded grid. It looks a bit messy, but it's enough to be helpful without showing up underneath the finished drawing. And now, using our grid and our gridded reference image, we can work our way through the drawing. You'll have to excuse the dodgy quality of the footage. I'm using different equipment than usual and I'm still figuring out all the settings, but I think I'm getting it all together. Some people might want to do the shading square by square, but sometimes going square by square can cause overlap where the squares meet, and the overlap can cause the tones to darken, and you can end up with soft dark lines going along your drawing where the grid lines were. Instead, I try to separate the drawing into more natural looking shapes and segments. So instead of drawing one square at a time, we're going to work on this little shape as its own area. This way the drawing can end up looking smoother and more natural. As I draw the flower, here are some quick fire grid tips that might help you. Tip number 1. I like to have a version of my reference without the grid as well as one with the grid. It's sometimes easier to see the shapes and tones without the grid confusing my brain. Number 2. I use Procreate to do my grids, but if you have a printer you can just as easily print the photo off and then draw the grid on by hand. And tip 3. If you have squares with a lot of details and you're finding it difficult to pinpoint everything, you can add diagonal lines to the squares going from corner to corner. It's a quick and easy way to add more reference lines without having to deal with precise measurements and loads of tiny squares. I do this a lot when the eyes are quite small and only take up one square each. Not getting rid of the grids completely is really helpful here. I left behind really faint grid lines so that I could still just about use them when doing the smaller details. Once I've covered an area in the first layer, it's harder to see them, but I can use the faint lines in the surrounding areas to help guide me. Dealing with grids can be an incredibly tedious part of the drawing process, but I think they can be really helpful with improving accuracy, and if all you want to do is recreate photos as accurately as possible, they're an amazing technique and tool to know, and they're well worth the time they take. We're coming to the end of the drawing now. I'm filling in the background with a nice light layer to try to cover up any remaining grid marks, as well as outlining the flower to make it stand out a little bit more, and then I'll be done. But as you can see, the grid has been a huge help all throughout this drawing. And here's our finished drawing. Feel free to comment down below and tell me if you plan on trying out grids or if you already use them. Now that you're getting your drawings even more accurate, click this video to find out which pencils are the best for getting your dark tones super dark without the annoying graphite shine. And if you found this video helpful, remember to like and subscribe to see more in the future.